Number 1. Andrea Zuccari. He was 48 years old and he had spent his life teaching human beings how to survive without air. Zuccari was an Italian-Swiss freediving instructor who ran the Freediving World Apnea Center in Sharm el-Sheikh on the Egyptian coast of the Red Sea. In 2017, he set an Italian no-limits record, riding a weighted sled down to 185 meters on a single held breath. He held Swiss national records too, and tandem no-limits world records earlier in his career. Few people alive understood pressure, and the human body's response to it as intimately as he did. That is what makes the 28th of August, 2023, so hard to accept. Zuccari did not vanish attempting some record. He disappeared on an ordinary maintenance dive on conventional scuba equipment, checking a deep dive platform at a depth of around 50 meters. He wore a backplate and wing rig and used an underwater scooter to reach the site. 50 meters is roughly 5 atmospheres of pressure, a depth he had passed thousands of times. He never came back up. When he failed to surface, his colleagues at the center raised the alarm, and Egyptian authorities began to search. Divers found pieces of his gear scattered in the blue. They never found him. Think about the irony for a moment. A man who taught lungs built for the surface to function far below it, undone not by a breath-hold record, but by the same routine descent he had made his whole life. The sheer walls off Sharm el-Sheikh drop past every technical limit, and the current there does not return what it takes. Consider the discipline he had built his life around. No limits. Freediving works like this. You ride a weighted sled straight down, sometimes past 180 meters, then trigger a lift bag to haul you back up before your body runs out of oxygen. It is widely regarded as the single most dangerous form of diving that exists, and Zuccari performed it at a world-class level. That is the measure of the man the Red Sea erased on a 50-meter housekeeping dive. His disappearance drew hard criticism of Egyptian dive tourism regulation and the speed of local search and rescue, criticism that would only sharpen as the season went on. Zuccari was the first of 3 divers the Red Sea would swallow that single year, and as you will see, the sea was only getting started. Number 2. John Bennett. If Zuccari mastered the breath, Bennett mastered the depth. Born on the 7th of March, 1959, this British diver became the first human being to scuba dive below 300 meters, 1,000 feet, on self-contained breathing apparatus. He climbed toward that record like a man climbing a ladder into the dark. 200 meters in 1999. 254 meters in the year 2000. Then, on his final record dive, 308 meters in 2001. Breathing trimix and hanging on decompression stops for hours as his body slowly, carefully surrendered the gas it had absorbed. At 308 meters, nitrogen narcosis, oxygen toxicity, and the logistics of helium all converge into something that should kill a person. Bennett managed all of it. He was, by any measure, one of the deepest diving humans who ever lived. And then he took a commercial salvage job off the coast of South Korea. On the 15th of March 2004, John Bennett went into the water for a working dive at a depth far shallower than his records, and he did not come out. He was reported missing, presumed dead. His body was never recovered. In 2006, he was declared legally dead. Here is the pattern beginning to form, and I want you to hold on to it. The man who survived 1,000 feet was killed by a routine day at the office. Salvage diving carries its own quiet killers: entanglement, current, a single equipment failure, and none of them care how deep you once went. Depth records make headlines. Ordinary work makes widows. It is worth understanding just how far ahead of his time Bennett was. When he reached 308 meters in 2001, he defined what many considered the practical ceiling of open-circuit scuba for that entire era. Divers who chased similar numbers, men like Mark Elliott and later Ahmed Gabr, who would take the record to 332 meters, were operating at the very edge of what a human body and a set of gas cylinders could physically do. Bennett was the pioneer they measured themselves against. His record stood as benchmarks in technical diving for years, and there was never a wreck, a body, or a definitive incident report to explain how the deepest of them all was lost so shallow. Keep that in mind, because our next diver was not chasing a record either. Number 3, Rob Palmer. Robert John Palmer was the man who made blue holes famous. A British cave diving pioneer, he explored the flooded blue holes of the Bahamas, founded a research foundation dedicated to them, and served the Explorers Club, the British Cave Diving Group, and the European arm of Technical Diving International. He was married to Stephanie Schwabe, a respected geomicrobiologist who studied those same drowned caves. Palmer did not just dive the deep, he wrote about it, taught it, and pulled the rest of us in after him. On the 5th of May, 1997, he was diving off the Gifton Island area in the Red Sea near Hurghada. Instead of swimming across to the reef wall, Palmer descended straight down from the dive boat. His companions went after him. One turned back at 70 meters. The other two last saw him at around 108 meters, still descending, still going down, faster than they could follow. A search was mounted. After roughly 6 hours, it was called off. His remains were never found. So what happened to a man that experienced? Consider 3 possibilities. The first is equipment failure, a sudden problem with his gas or his buoyancy that he could not correct. The second is nitrogen narcosis, that dreamy fatal confusion that thickens at depth on open circuit and can convince a diver that down is a fine direction to keep going. The third, quietly discussed in diving circles, is that there was no dramatic cause at all, simply a descent that passed the point where thought becomes impossible. Here is the detail that haunts the case. At 108 meters, breathing gas on open circuit, narcosis presses on the mind like a heavy sedative. A diver in that state may not feel that anything is wrong at all. He may simply keep finning downward, calm and unhurried, into water that will kill him. Palmer had spent his career mapping the flooded caves of the Bahamas and teaching others to survive them, which is the bitter irony at the center of his story, that the very expertise that made him famous could not save him from a single unrecoverable descent. The 1990s predated much of the modern rebreather and mixed gas safety practice that came afterward, and technical diving was still writing its rulebook in real time. The Blue Holes Foundation carried on in his name. 26 years later, the same stretch of Red Sea would claim another diver in almost the same way. Number 4. Ben McDaniel. This is the case that refuses to close. McDaniel was 30 years old from Memphis, Tennessee, and on the 18th of August, 2010, he entered Vortex Spring, a popular recreational dive site near Ponce de Leon, Florida. He went in alone, near sunset, with no dive buddy. The mouth of the cave sits about 50 to 58 feet down. Roughly 300 feet into the cavern, there is a metal gate, and beyond it, the passage is narrow, in places to as little as 10 inches across. Here is the first problem. Only cave-certified divers are supposed to receive a key to that gate. Ben McDaniel was not cave-certified. An employee unlocked it for him anyway. On the morning of the 20th of August, staff noticed his truck still sitting in the parking lot, and they called the Holmes County Sheriff's Office. Searchers went in. They found 2 of his decompression tanks. They did not find him. Expert divers went deeper. Remote-operated vehicles pushed into the tight sections. Nothing. Now, the theories, and this is where it gets strange. The first, held firmly by his parents, is that his body lies wedged in an inaccessible restriction far inside the cave, somewhere no human or machine can reach. The second, raised by the Holmes County Sheriff himself, is that Ben McDaniel never died in that cave at all. He had been going through personal difficulties, and the sheriff openly doubted the drowning story. The third possibility, darker still, is foul play, that something happened to him on land, and the cave became a convenient explanation. Every version of this story runs into the same wall. If he drowned in an inaccessible restriction, why did the tanks turn up but never the body, in a cave that expert divers and machines mapped section by section? If he walked away, where did a man with personal troubles go, leaving his truck in the lot and no trace on land? If someone harmed him, who and how and why has nothing surfaced in more than a decade. The case became a fixture of true crime television, featured on the series Disappeared under the title The Vortex, and it still carries a dedicated encyclopedia entry because the public simply refuses to let it rest. The one thing everyone agrees on is that an unlocked gate, open for a diver who was never trained to pass it, sits at the center of the whole tragedy. A cave, at least, can be searched. As our next case shows, there are places where searching is barely possible at all. Number 5. Per Skipnes. Most missing diver stories are about explorers and record seekers. This one is about a working man. Per Skipnes was a Norwegian commercial diver in the brutal early years of North Sea saturation diving, and he died in the Drillmaster diving accident in January of 1974. It was a two-man operation from a diving bell lowered to around 320 feet beneath the surface off Norway. What happened next is one of the most horrifying mechanisms in all of commercial diving. The bell's drop weight was accidentally released. Freed of that ballast, the bell shot upward toward the surface and its bottom door was open. The diver working outside the bell was still connected to it by his umbilical, the lifeline carrying his gas and his heat. As the bell rocketed up, it dragged him through the freezing black water on that umbilical. Both men, Per Skipnes and Robert John Smith, died from the rapid decompression and drowning that followed. Smith's body was recovered. Skipnes' body was never found. The 1970s were the oil boom years in the North Sea, and the fatality record from that era is grim. Bell accidents like this one, along with the Wildrake and Star Canopus disasters later in 1978, forced the industry to confront its drop weight systems, its locking pins, and its safety culture. Norway's North Sea divers would spend decades afterward fighting for recognition and compensation for what that work did to their bodies. But Skipnes never got to fight for anything. His family got no remains to bury. Sometimes the sea is not even the enemy. Sometimes the machine is. Picture the physics of it for a moment. A sealed bell is meant to be a refuge, a pocket of breathable gas and warmth lowered into the crushing dark. When its drop weight let go, that refuge became a runaway elevator, tearing upward with its floor hatch open, hauling a tethered man behind it through water cold enough to kill on its own. The uncontrolled ascent exposed both divers to catastrophic decompression, hypothermia, and drowning all at once. This was the raw, unforgiving early era of North Sea saturation work before the drop weight redesigns and locking pin reforms that later inquiries demanded. The men who did this work would spend decades afterward fighting for recognition of what it cost their bodies. Per Skipnes never got that chance, and sometimes, as our next diver shows, the enemy is simply going deeper than you planned. Number 6. Kristina Osipova. She was 44 years old from St. Petersburg and a mother of 4 children. In August of 2023, Kristina Osipova was on a roughly 10-day dive cruise in the Red Sea with her husband Yuri Osipov, who was 41. They were diving off Gifton Island near Hurghada, and both were described as experienced divers. On the fatal dive, they went past their plan. The plan called for a maximum depth of 40 meters. Yuri's dive computer would later show a maximum of around 400 feet, roughly 120 meters. At that depth on recreational gear, nitrogen narcosis and oxygen toxicity stop being risks and start being near certainties. Both of them lost consciousness in the dark. Yuri came to, or held on somehow, and made it to the surface. His wife did not come up with him. The search that followed was joined by Ahmed Gaber, the technical diver who holds the record for the deepest scuba dive ever made, 332 meters. If anyone on Earth could reach her, it was him. The team could not locate her body. Mustafa Nabil, captain of the rescue ship, said the strong currents at depth may have carried her away and that she may never be found. Notice where this happened. It is the same region that took Rob Palmer 26 years earlier and the same summer that took Andrea Zuccari. 3 divers, 1 sea, 1 year, a mother of 4, a husband who surfaced alone into an empty blue. There's a lesson buried in the numbers here that every recreational diver should carry. A plan of 40 meters is already deep. 120 meters is a completely different world, a place where a single breath of ordinary air becomes toxic, and the mind clouds so heavily that divers have been known to hand their regulators to fish. The gap between what they planned and what actually happened, 80 meters of it, is the whole difference between a normal dive and a fatal one. And even with Ahmed Gaber, the deepest scuba diver on the planet, joining the search, the currents held their secret. What makes people go deeper than they ever meant to? Our next case did not involve depth at all. Number 7, Bry Nazareno. Some divers are lost to depth, some are lost to distance. Bry Nazareno was a Filipino diver on a trip to Tubataha Reef, a remote marine park in the Sulu Sea off Palawan, reachable only by live-aboard boat. On the 3rd of June, he was diving with a friend and a group aboard the vessel Palau sport. About 11 minutes into the dive during the ascent, the group looked around and realized he was no longer with them. That is the whole horror of it. Not a scream, not a struggle anyone saw, just a gap in the water where a person had been. Tubataha is famous for its sheer coral walls and its strong currents, and those currents can peel a diver off the reef and carry him into open blue water in seconds. Once that happens, at a site this remote, the odds collapse. There is no coastal search and rescue base nearby. The nearest real help is hours or days away by boat. His wife was reported as remaining hopeful as the search went on. He was never recovered. This is a modern story and a warning that applies to almost anyone. You do not need to be a record breaker chasing 300 meters to disappear. You do not need a cave. At a recreational depth on a beautiful reef, a current can separate you from your group and hand you to the open ocean, which keeps what it is given. The remoteness that makes a place like Tubataha pristine is the same remoteness that makes rescue nearly impossible. Think about the timeline. 11 minutes. That is how long the dive had been going when the group turned and found an empty space in the water. There was no warning, no signal, no moment anyone could point to. In blue water diving along a vertical wall, separation and disappearance can be almost the same instant because the current does not tug gently. It sweeps. A live-aboard site in the middle of the Sulu Sea has no Coast Guard station around the corner and no helicopter minutes away. By the time a search can even be organized, the ocean has had hours to move a body across water that goes down for a kilometer or more. His family waited for news that never came. Our next diver vanished in warm, popular, shallow water that thousands of tourists enjoy every year. Number 8. Gregory Romes. Cozumel, off the coast of Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula, is one of the most famous drift diving destinations in the world. Divers there do not fight the current. They surrender to it, letting the Caribbean carry them along vibrant reef walls while a boat follows their rising bubbles. It is glorious. It is also exactly how Gregory Romes, a 74-year-old American diver, was lost at sea off the northern coast of the island and never found. The very thing that makes Cozumel special is what makes it dangerous. The currents there can run at 2 to 3 knots faster than a diver can swim against them. The northern channel can funnel a diver away from the reef and out toward open ocean. Drift diving depends entirely on the boat keeping track of you. And if that thread breaks, if the crew loses your bubbles in the chop, you can be swept beyond the search area before anyone understands what has happened. Age adds its own weight to the odds, compounding fatigue, buoyancy control, and gas management. Romes was carried off, and despite the search, the sea did not give him back. I want you to sit with what this case means, because it is the least dramatic and maybe the most unsettling on this list. No extreme depth, no cave, no monster. Just warm blue water, a strong current, and distance. The plainest killer in the ocean. Every drift dive briefing warns about exactly this, and it happens anyway. There is a reason drift diving off Cozumel is sold as a highlight and also whispered about as a hazard. The currents that sweep you effortlessly past a wall of coral are the same currents that can carry you out of a boat cruise sightline in under a minute. Once your bubbles are lost in the chop, the search has to guess which way the sea took you, across a moving target of open water. For an older diver, the margin shrinks further because fatigue, buoyancy control, and gas management all become harder in current. Warm water and a famous name on the map do not change the arithmetic. But the ocean does not always take you so gently. Sometimes, as our next two divers learned, it has teeth. Number 9. Peter Clarkson. Now we turn to the predators. Peter Clarkson was a veteran abalone diver, 49 years old, working the waters off South Australia, one of the densest great white shark populations anywhere on the planet. In February of 2011, near Coffin Bay on the Eyre Peninsula, he was attacked not by one great white, but by 2, as he surfaced beside his boat. The boat was skippered by Howard Rodd, a man who a decade earlier had survived a 50-hour swim to shore after his own vessel was overturned by a freak wave. He watched the water take his diver. Despite an immediate search, no remains were ever recovered. To understand this, you have to understand abalone diving in South Australia. These divers work on surface-supplied hookah rigs tethered to the boat by an air hose, moving slowly along the bottom in waters where great whites patrol constantly. They accept that risk because abalone is worth a great deal of money. The Eyre Peninsula and the nearby Neptune Islands are a great white stronghold, and the fishery's history is written in these losses, some of them going back to the 1970s. 2 large sharks leave almost nothing behind. That is the plain, terrible reason Clarkson was never found. And notice once again that experience offered no protection. He was a professional, not a tourist, doing a job he had done for years. The predator category is the rarest kind of disappearance on this list, but it is the most visceral, and it forces an uncomfortable question about the fishery itself. Abalone divers accept these odds knowingly, because the catch is worth enough money to justify working in some of the most shark-dense water on Earth, tethered to the surface by a hose and moving slowly across the bottom. The economics push people into the predator's living room day after day. South Australia's record of abalone diver deaths stretches back decades into the 1970s, and it is a quiet, grim ledger the wider public rarely sees. Peter Clarkson was one entry in it, an experienced professional taken in seconds. South Australia is not the only Australian coast where it happens. On the far side of the continent, a great white was waiting for a man who led his local dive club. Number 10. Gary Johnson. Gary Johnson was the president of the Esperance Dive Club in Western Australia, an experienced and respected diver in his own community. On the 5th of January 2020, he entered the water near Cull Island off West Beach at around 1 in the afternoon. His wife, Karen Milligan, was on the boat. She watched a great white shark take her husband, and she was later hospitalized for shock. By the time other boaters reached the area, there was almost nothing to find. Searchers recovered his swim fins and his torn wetsuit. They never recovered his body. This was the first fatal shark attack recorded anywhere in the world in 2020, and it was covered around the globe. Esperance's cold, deep, current-swept south coast is a known great white hotspot, and it had claimed divers before. An ambush from below by a large great white is fast and catastrophic, and in open water, it rarely leaves recoverable remains. I want to pause on those recovered items because they are the heart of this case, and honestly, the heart of this whole video. Fins and a shredded wetsuit floating in the water, and nothing else. The gear came back. The diver did not. That single image, gear without a person, is the signature of so many of these stories, whether the cause is a shark, a current, or the crushing dark. Gary Johnson was skilled, experienced, and beloved, and the ocean did not care. His death reopened a bitter national argument in Australia about shark mitigation on the country's southern coast, an argument that has no easy answer because the great white is a protected species and the ocean is its home, not ours. Esperance had lost divers to sharks before and would remain a place where the risk is simply part of entering the water. 2 coasts, 2 great whites, 2 experienced divers, and in both cases almost nothing to bury. When you set Clarkson and Johnson side by side, the pattern is undeniable that expertise, community standing, and years in the water buy you no protection at all from a predator that has been perfecting its ambush for millions of years. But of all 11 divers on this list, the last 2 were unique. They survived long enough to leave a message. Number 11. Tom and Eileen Lonergan. Tom and Eileen Lonergan were an American married couple, former Peace Corps volunteers, and their disappearance is the most famous on this list for a reason. On the 25th of January 1998, they boarded the dive boat MV Outer Edge in Port Douglas, Australia, and went out to dive Agincourt Reef, part of the Great Barrier Reef. They completed their dive. And then the crew, failing to complete an accurate head count, pulled up the anchor and left them behind in the open sea. No one noticed for 2 days, 2 full days. The truth only emerged when crew found a bag aboard containing the couple's belongings, their wallets, and their passports. Months later, a fisherman found a dive slate washed up on the coast. On it was a message, a plea, dated the 26th of January 1998, begging anyone who found it for rescue, stating they had been abandoned on the reef by the MV Outer Edge, asking for help before they died. That slate proved something unbearable. They had survived at least a full day, alive and adrift, watching an empty horizon, writing to a world that had already sailed away. Despite extensive searches, no trace of their bodies was ever found. Some of their equipment later washed ashore. Nothing suggested a violent end, and the leading explanations are exposure, dehydration, and drowning. Their story inspired the 2003 film Open Water, which invented a shark attack, ending the real evidence never supported. The dive operator faced manslaughter charges, and the skipper was ultimately acquitted, but the case forced sweeping reforms to how Australian dive boats count and track their passengers. Of all the ways to be lost at sea, theirs may be the cruelest. Sit with the sequence one more time. They did nothing wrong underwater. They surfaced from a normal dive to find their boat gone and the horizon empty in every direction. Then they waited, treading water on a reef, watching the light change, and at some point one of them took out a dive slate and wrote a message, asking strangers to save them, dating it carefully, as if the date mattered, as if someone would come. No one came. The slate drifted for months before a fisherman found it. The couple never did. The operator was charged with manslaughter, the skipper was eventually acquitted, and the whole industry rewrote its rules for counting passengers so that this exact failure could not happen the same way again. Not depth, not a predator, a head count. Step back from the individual stories and a harder question comes into focus. Why is it that the ocean so rarely gives these people back? The reasons are physical, and they are relentless. At extreme depth, a body can come to rest below the range of any diver and beyond the practical reach of a remote-operated vehicle. Strong currents disperse a body across hundreds of square kilometers, turning a search into an impossibility. In caves, silt-out conditions and restrictions narrowing to inches block every attempt to follow. Cold water changes buoyancy and slows decomposition in unpredictable ways, while scavengers do their work in the dark. There's a cruel detail that connects almost every case on this list. Gear floats. Bodies weighed by equipment and physics often do not. That is why searchers so frequently recover a fin, a tank, a wetsuit, a slate, and nothing more. Tides and channels funnel a lost diver toward open ocean, exactly the direction that makes recovery hopeless. Sonar and cameras struggle in complex terrain, and searches are not infinite. They cost money and burn daylight, and they end. Rob Palmer's search was called off after 6 hours. The Lonergans drifted for 2 days before anyone even knew to look. Every so often, luck intervenes, and a body is found years later by chance divers exploring a wall. But those are the rare exceptions. Think of the recovery odds by environment, because they are wildly different. A shallow open water body might drift ashore within days. A body in a cave restriction may be findable in principle, but physically unreachable forever. A diver lost past 200 meters, or swept into an open ocean current, is almost certainly gone for good, because the search area expands faster than any team can cover it, and the pressure and cold do their work in the dark. This is why record dives, the deepest of all, leave the least to find. The reasons the ocean keeps them are physical and predictable. The pattern that ties the cases together, though, turns out to be human. Lay the 11 cases side by side, and they sort themselves into clear categories. There is depth, the technical killer, that took Andrea Zuccari, John Bennett, Rob Palmer, and Kristina Osipova. There is the cave, which swallowed Ben McDaniel, or perhaps did not. There is the industrial deep, which killed Per Skipnes at his work. There is open water drift, the plain distance that carried off Bry Nazareno and Gregory Romes. There is predation, the great whites that took Peter Clarkson and Gary Johnson. And there is human error, the failed headcount that abandoned Tom and Eileen Lonergan. Look at who is on this list: a world record depth diver, a world-famous cave explorer, a freediving champion, a club president, a commercial professional, a mother of 4, elite specialists, and ordinary recreational divers, side by side, meeting the exact same end. That is the lesson hiding in the categories. The environment decides, not the skill. Depth is the deadliest single variable, and it does not check your certifications first. Current is the quietest, taking you without a sound. Predators are the rarest and the most visceral. Human error is the most preventable of all, and yet it recurs. Certain regions appear again and again. The Red Sea walls, the South Australian shark grounds, because the danger there is concentrated. Experience buys you competence, but the ocean equalizes everyone. Notice, too, how the categories overlap inside single cases. Osipova's death was depth and current together. Skipnes was industrial failure and cold water at once. The Lonergans were human error compounded by open water exposure over days. These are not tidy boxes. They are overlapping forces, and a diver usually meets more than one at the moment things go wrong. What each category teaches is slightly different. Depth teaches that pressure does not negotiate. Current teaches that distance kills as surely as depth. Predators teach that we are visitors in a food web we did not design. And when you trace many of these so-called accidents back to their beginning, you find something uncomfortable. You find a single choice. Pull that thread and the mysteries start to look less like mysteries. An employee unlocked a gate at Vortex Spring for a diver who was not cave certified. A crew on the MV Outer Edge miscounted heads and sailed away from 2 living people. A couple off Gifton Island pushed past a 40-meter plan to 120 meters. A diving bell's drop weight and locking pins failed on the drill master. Again and again, behind the vanishing, there is a decision that did not have to go the way it went. This is the part that should stay with you. Ben McDaniel diving beyond his certification, alone, at dusk. Rob Palmer descending straight down from the boat rather than across to the wall. A gap always opens between the procedure written on paper and the practice that happens in the water, and that gap is where divers disappear. But here is the redemptive side of the pattern. Each of these failures wrote a rule. The Lonergan's abandonment reshaped how Australian dive boats count and track passengers. The North Sea Bell disasters of the 1970s forced reforms in saturation diving safety that protect commercial divers today. Regulation has real limits in remote waters, and responsibility is always shared between operator and diver. But the safety culture that keeps modern divers alive was built, decision by decision, on the losses in this video. There's a hard truth folded into that. Many of the cases we call mysteries are not really mysterious at all in their mechanism. We may not know the exact instant Rob Palmer lost control, or precisely where Ben McDaniel ended up, but we know the shape of the failure. A descent that went too far, a gate that should have stayed locked, a plan that was abandoned, a count that was never properly made. The mystery is emotional, not technical. It is the mystery of why a careful person makes one uncareful choice, and why the ocean charges the maximum penalty for it every single time. And behind every one of those system failures is a family still waiting. Because these divers are not just names on a list. Behind each one is someone who surfaced alone, or watched from a boat, or waited by a phone. Yuri Osipov came up from that dive off Gifton Island without his wife. Karen Milligan saw a shark take her husband and could do nothing. Bry Nazareno's wife held on to hope as a search stretched on with no result. Ben McDaniel's parents remain convinced years later that their son lies somewhere deep in a cave that will not surrender him. Per Skipnes' family were left with no remains at all in 1974, and never got them. There's a specific kind of grief here that psychologists call ambiguous loss, the pain of a death without a body, a person who is gone but never definitively returned. It denies closure. It complicates the law, which is why John Bennett had to be declared legally dead in 2006, 2 years after he vanished. And it leaves a vacuum that theories rush to fill, which is part of why these cases stay alive in our imagination for decades. Some of that remembering becomes something better. The Blue Holes Foundation carried Rob Palmer's work forward. Communities were reshaped and reformed by single losses. And the Lonergan's dive slate, that final scratched message asking for help, endures as one of the most haunting artifacts in the history of diving. Sometimes the searching itself claims more lives because the pull to bring a body home is so strong that other divers accept enormous risks to try, a pattern the diving world knows well from cases where recovery attempts became fatalities of their own. That is how deep the need for closure runs. When there is no body, there is no funeral in the ordinary sense, no final proof, only an ending that never quite ends, held open for years by the smallest thread of hope. It is a specific and lonely kind of grief, and it belongs to everyone connected to these 11 divers. So what, in the end, Do the missing teach us? They teach us humility. For all our modern equipment, our mixed gas computers, our remote-operated vehicles, and our depth records, the ocean still cannot be guaranteed to give a body back. That is not a failure of technology. It is the honest scale of the sea. The deep remains genuinely unmastered, and every safety reform we now rely on was written in the aftermath of a vanishing, paid for by someone who did not come home. Depth, current, cold, and predators are not problems we have solved. They are constant limits, and the divers on this list ran into each of them in turn. There is a thin line between a routine dive and a catastrophe, and these 11 people crossed it in 11 different ways, from a 50-meter maintenance dive to a head count on a boat. Each of their stories reframes the others. Together, they remind us of the difference between visiting the deep and conquering it, because no one conquers it. We keep diving anyway, and we should, drawn by the same wonder that drew Palmer into his blue holes and Zuccari into the still water off Sharm el-Sheikh. But we should dive remembering the vast, dark, unexplored volume where more people will inevitably be lost. For the recreational diver, the takeaways are almost embarrassingly simple, and they are written in the deaths on this list. Respect your plan. Keep a buddy. Understand the current before you enter it. Never let ambition or ego push you past the number you agreed on. For the professional, the lessons are harder and larger about systems, redundancy, and the honest accounting of risk. But for all of us, the deepest lesson is the same one the sea has been teaching since the first person held their breath and slipped beneath the surface. The ocean is an archive that rarely returns what it takes. And somewhere above each of these 11 divers, the surface closed over, went quiet, and shone with a little light none of them ever reached again.